Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate the techniques I use to create this scene. So you can see I called it gems. You've got these shiny little objects that appear to be rotating, and it may not be too visible, but we've got this sort of background which is actually a repeat of the foreground, and then it changes view and we can see from inside the object, and we've got some sunbeams going on there as well and a few other effects. So actually the most complicated part of this is the compositing at the end. So I'll go quite quickly through this and demonstrate how I created this object. So to begin with, we just need a mesh object of some description. I won't necessarily create exactly the same shape, but my thinking when I created the shape that I did was to have something with a number of facets on it. More than just you would get with a simple cube. So I'm just applying a couple more loops on here. I've got loop tools enabled. And then we can perhaps grab these two faces, extrude them forward, and then perhaps set this to individual origins and scale them down. I'm just going for something somewhat similar to the shape that I created. And then I'll select these faces and these faces. Press I for inset and just make them a little smaller. Then go back to median point and scale on the Z, and that then gives us some extra faces there. And perhaps inset that face as well and push that one in too. Maybe even this one and this one. And because I left it on median, it's gone inside as well as shrunk the face. So we've got a number of facets there. I'm just sort of adding a few more. The thinking was to just catch the light somewhat. Have lots of faces that would catch the light and twinkle sort of thing. So that will do for our shape, and then we'll apply a new material. We go to our node editor. I'm going to replace the basic diffuse with the principled shader, which by the way I think is now the default in Blender 2.8. This is 2.79 I'm using at the moment. I'm then going to add a color mix node. Drop that into the color input on the principled shader. I left it at the default of multi-scatter, and I set one color to a sort of beigey color and the other one reasonably strong but still quite bright orange color. Perhaps brighten that one up a little bit too. Then I added one more node, which is a layer weight node, and took the Fresnel output into the control on that mix, and I had it a default of 0.5. My thinking being that this would give us a slightly different color depending on what angle we were looking at a given facet, and we'll just give it a orangish viewport color so we know what we're looking at. So I'm just going to add a basic lamp into the scene at the moment. I had slightly more than just a simple lamp, but I'm just putting one in so we can see what we're doing when I'm rendering. And what we now need to do is just make a few other changes down here. So I left metallic at 0. I turned specular right down, so that gives you a much sharper reflection. I had roughness at only 0.02. I had clear coat up at 1, and I turned transmission up high as well. So what you can see is we're only really seeing the reflections now. A lot of what you can and can't see will depend on the lighting conditions. So because essentially this is now a transparent object, if I make the sun a little brighter, we'll put that up at 3. In fact, we'll change this to a point light now, and I'll put a couple more around the scene, and they need to be a lot brighter because they're point lights. And you can start to see we're catching the light in various different places rather than the whole thing being visible at once. We can also play with the size of the lamps. The bigger the lamp is, and although they're called sun, these aren't sun lamps now, these are spot lamps, the more will be visible, as it were. So you can see we've got that now. But there's quite a bit more to do with the lighting yet. That's just very quick lighting just to show you the sort of effect we're getting. And of course I had probably a few more facets on mine than I currently have on this one. But obviously you can play around with materials. I'll just set this up very quickly at the moment. So now we need to make some changes to our object. So I'm just going to remove the node editor now. I'm going to scale the object down a little bit, then go into edit mode, select all the vertices and just move everything over to one side slightly, leaving the origin point, that little orange dot, in the middle. I've already got the 3D cursor at the center of the object. If it's not there, you can just say Shift S and say cursor to selected, and it will appear in the middle there. But you'll need to be out of edit mode for it to appear where the origin point is. Having done that, we come over to modifiers and we add an array modifier. I used a count of 30 objects, so that's going to make 30 copies of the object. and I turned off relative offset. So we've still got 30 copies, but they're all on top of each other at the moment. And I'm now going to add a new object, which is an empty. So an empty is an object that you can use to control or reference other objects, but it never renders. It doesn't have any vertices in it or anything like that. So that's been created right there, and that's by default called just empty. Go back to my object, click on Object Offset in the modifier, and select the empty. Now at the moment, that empty doesn't change anything. If I just move that empty, you can see nothing seems to be happening. But the reason for that is if we zoom out, you can actually see there's one of our copies. And if we zoom out further, there's another, and each one is bigger. And that's because the scale on our object hasn't been applied. So I'm going to Control A and apply scale. In fact, I'm going to apply location, rotation, and scale. So if I apply location and then rotation and scale, now you can see it's a bit more straightforward. If I move on the Z, you can see as I approach the center of the screen, everything lines up with itself again. And GX, everything lines up with itself again there. So now everything's on top of itself. So all 30 copies are in one place. If I rotate on the Z now, you can see they run around like that. And exactly how many copies, that's up to you. You can say fit curve. If it's a curve, you can say fit length. You can just adjust the count if you want to have just the right amount, but clearly with the rotation I've got on there at the moment, that's about right. So if we have a look at what rotation I ended up with, on my empty, I've got about 12 degrees. For 30, that's going to be about right. Anything different to that, you're going to need either more or less. So that's created our first set of objects. So now to create the next set. So I'm going to add a modifier, and it's going to be another array modifier. I'm also going to create a new empty. So I'm just going to say Shift D, and copy that one, and we'll just put it up here for the moment so we can see what it is. And we can change the form of the empty by clicking here so we can easily see which one's which. And let's make this one a cube. It has no impact on the function, it just makes it look different. Come over to our new array, which is this one here. Turn off relative offset, turn on object offset, and set it to empty 001. You can now see that's created a copy of that ring of objects at an offset that is set by the position of that empty. So for this one, I created 10 copies. So let's set this to 10, and you can see there they all are. But I wanted them to shrink as they went. So instead of rotating this cube, what I'm going to do is scale it. So press S, and as you see, when I scale it, they get smaller each time because each one is inheriting the scale of the previous one and then applying the change in scale for that empty. So that's what gives you this gradually changing shape. And it could be getting bigger, of course, but in this case, I'm going smaller. And then I applied another array. Again, we said object offset, and I added, we'll put it down here this time, another empty, and we'll make this one a sphere. Again, doesn't change the way it works. I then select my empty O2, and I'm going to give that a rotation, rotate Y 90, and we'll give it 2 more objects. Now we notice we've got a scale issue here, so I'm just going to apply the scale to that object, and I'm just moving that empty around just to get the sort of shape I'm looking for. Make sure you apply any rotations if you're going to copy other shapes, otherwise you might get a few issues like that. So something like that is the shape that I ended up with. And then we need one more array. So add array modifier. I just had 2 this time. I've put the cursor back to the center, and I'm going to add another empty, and we'll make it a cone this time. It doesn't really matter. Turn off relative and turn on object offset for empty 003. You can see there's another set of these shapes linked, and we can set that however we wish to, perhaps like that. So I just rotated it about 90 degrees, rotate Z 90. It's not precisely the shape that I made before, but that'll do for now. So we're now ready to apply some animation to this. Let's just have a look at what we've got. So in the render view, you can see we're starting to get something appearing. We're going to need to play with the lights a little bit. So I'm just going to turn off the last 2 of my arrays just so that I can see what I'm doing better. So here's our first empty, and I decided to rotate that one on the Y about 45 degrees across the animation. So if I hover over here with the object property selected and the first empty selected, press I to record the current rotation, go to the end of the animation, set this to 45 and press I again. Immediately I'm going to go to the graph editor, select key, interpolation mode and say linear. If you have a look at the curve on that rotation, it starts slow, speeds up, and then slows down again as it gets to where it wants to go. In this case, I wanted it to be linear so that I could, if I wanted to, I could link these animations together. There wouldn't be any variations in speed. So if we press play now, you can see we're getting some interesting effects there. So if we press play, and as we put more of these arrays, make more of these arrays visible, you may well find Blender struggles to keep up. In order to make sure that you can really get a feel for how the animation is working, you go down to playback and just select frame dropping. That will mean it will try to maintain the frame rate that you've set up, in my case 25 frames a second, by jumping over some frames. It won't do that in the actual render, but it will do it when it's trying to represent it. So that's that one. If I now select my object and turn on another of the arrays, you can see what that's doing. And then I turn on the last of the arrays, and you can see that's having quite an interesting effect across all of them. And in fact, I didn't add any other animations to the object itself for the entire animation. What I then did was animate the camera. So let's just turn those off for the moment. So now we need to put some mechanism for moving the camera on. So I'm just going to put the cursor in the center, then add a mesh circle. Because it doesn't really have any dimensions yet, it won't be visible, and I'm not going to give it any. I'm going to put the camera coincident with the circle and just move those down to about level. And then so I'm just parenting the camera to the object, keep transform, and now select my circle. If I rotate on the Z, my circle, you can see the camera goes with it and keeps pointing toward the middle. So I'm just going to rotate on the X the camera at 90 degrees, then have a look through the camera, select my circle and just scale that out a little bit until the camera is far enough away that it can see all of the shape. Now look from above, go to the beginning of the animation and select the object properties for the circle, press I and select rotation. Having recorded a keyframe there, we'll go to the end of the animation, type 360 in Z and press I there. Press play, and then you can see, just about see, our camera is now following that circle as it rotates. If we just look through, looks like we need to make the circle just a little bit bigger, just to have the camera slightly further away. And we can move the circle around a little bit. That's really the easiest way to do this. You can apply other modifiers to the camera, you can follow paths and things like that, but if you just want to orbit, that's a very easy way to do it. I also put a camera inside and just had it rotating around as well, but that'll do for now, and that's our basic setup. If I turn on the last of the array modifiers, you can see we've got some interesting stuff going on there. And in rendered view, we've started to get something appearing. So let's just replace these lights now. So I'm going to change this one to a sort of turquoisey blue color. I'm then going to select this one and just put it sort of over here somewhere. I'm going to set this one to a sort of yellowish color. And we're going to make it really bright. Let's set that to 20,000. And I'm going to set it to area as well. I'm going to make it a rectangle and just scale it up on the Y to something like 12. I just pressed Alt R to remove all rotations, then rotate on the X and rotate on the Z just to have it pointing really at my main object. I'm just going to delete that lamp there, Shift D to make a copy of that lamp and rotate it to point in towards the center. And then we'll have a look how that's looking. I'll set the size of that lamp now to about 1. So the idea of that is that it just gives us some different colors as we go around. And if I add a few more samples, we'll make it 50 samples, you can see we're starting to get our shape build up. And as I also said, you really need quite a few facets for this to show up because we're using those reflections of the faces that are at an angle to the viewer to give us the shapes that we can see. In the meantime, I can always change the material a little bit just to make it a bit more visible. Let's just put the number of samples down to 25. We can add some metallic to it, for example. We can put some specular back in. We can take the transmission down slightly. And obviously that's not what I had, but you can see the shapes a lot better. I had mine as completely transmissive, and you can see how the lights are sort of showing slightly differently depending on what axis you're looking from. So if we just have a quick look round, see what different effects we're getting. And obviously by adding different coloured lights, you'll get different effects as well. So it's quite dark from this angle. So if I took this lamp, perhaps put it down here, perhaps make it even brighter, and make this one a purple lamp. Now you can see we've got some more colours. So a lot of the effect is created through the lighting of the object. So that's the basic animation and creation of the array object. And now we need to go on to the compositing. So before we do that, let's just make a quick render of our shape. Let's go with it at the beginning of the animation. And we'll say at 100 samples and just render that. So you can see it's quite noisy, but I will actually denoise it toward the end as well. But this will do for now. So I've got a node editor open, and I'm going to go to the compositing nodes and say use nodes. This is going to be relatively complex at the end because there's going to be quite a few nodes. But once you get the idea of what I'm doing, the fact that it's being done multiple times isn't too much of a problem. So to begin with, here's our render layer, and that's going out to our compositing node, which is what comes out down here. I'm going to add an additional node joiner here just because it makes it a lot easier to segregate what areas I'm sending where. So I just pressed Shift and dragged a line down through it, and it adds this little joiner node to help with the layout of our node group. So I'm going to add a filter, which is a blur filter, and just drop it in there. Push that up here somewhere. I'm going to set it to fast Gaussian, relative, Y, so that's the aspect correction because it's a wide scene rather than a tall one. And I'm going to set this to about 0.25%. So it's not very much, it's just a little bit. This is going to form the background of our scene, and I therefore don't need it to be the high fidelity of detail that we're going to need for the foreground of our scene. And it just makes it a little less noisy and thickens some lines up and things like that. That's why the blur. Under the distort settings, I'm going to add a scale node. Just drop that in there, leave it on relative, and set this to 0.5. You see that's shrunk there, and then 0.5 on the Y as well. So that's just made the whole image a little bit smaller. I'm going to add another scale node, add a little joiner node there, take that into the input and leave it on the 0.5 again. I'm going to add a flip node, and I'll explain this in a moment. Take that into there and set this to flip X and Y. Now if I take that to the output, you can maybe just about see, if you look where that pink bit is, it just literally flips the whole image over, both on the X and the Y. So I'm now going to add translate node. Translate is just a fancy word for move. I'm going to put that there for the moment. I'm going to say both axes, and I'm going to say minus 480 for X. You can see that just moved it over to the left, and minus 269 for the Y, and that pushed it down to the bottom. So it's now in the bottom left corner. Duplicate that node and take the output of that flip node into the input of that one. Change this to plus 480 and plus 271. I'm giving you these specific numbers because at least at 1080p resolution, these are the numbers you need. If you're rendering at any other resolution, you'll need to just tweak these numbers to see what fits. So I'm now going to add a color mix node, drop that there, change it to screen, and then take that output there and put it into the other side. So what that's done is it's actually created an image here and an image here, but you can only see one at a time at the moment because of the way Blender works. They'll both be visible shortly. Just going to move things over a little bit. So I'm going to select all of those nodes, duplicate them and put them there, and then connect that input into there. Probably doesn't need to be quite as messy as this. We don't really need as many nodes as this. We could just use extra outputs from these, but it helps with the thinking process sometimes to do it this way. So the top two are minus 480, minus 269, then 480, 271. The bottom two translates are minus 480, plus 271, and 480, minus 269. So all we're doing really is moving copies of these images between this corner, this corner, this corner, and this corner. Now we need to put them together, so we'll add another color mix node. Set this one to lighten, take each of those outputs into there, and then that into the final output at the moment. But it's still not there yet, we've got a bit more to do. Now in order to simplify our overall setup, we'll make a group out of these. So I'm going to select all of those, and just say add make group, or Control G would do the same. So you can see the background's changed colour now. If I press tab, all of that is now represented by one node group. But if we click this little symbol here, it all opens up again. I then actually started creating another node group because this one's a little complicated as well. In essence, this one is exactly the same as the previous one. So I'm just going to duplicate that node group and put it into there. And you notice we've already got multiple copies now, but I'm going to open that one up and change some of the numbers. So this time our scale is going to be 0.125 in each of these boxes. So this is making the images smaller. And then to the translate options, change that -480 to -240. Leave the -269. The next translate, 480 becomes 240. The next one, -480 becomes -240. And the final one, 480 becomes 240. So you can see we just halved one of the axes. So if we come out of that node group now and we add color mix node, drop that in there. We put this on the bottom and we set the top to black, and we've started to get some patterning. As always happens, probably find you need to adjust the settings. Something I should have said, if you copy a node group that way, you'll notice we've got a number in here. So if I make changes to either of these node groups, it will affect the other one. So we need to click this little number to make it a unique node group. Now I can go back to this one and set these numbers back to where they were the first time around. Very much like many other things in Blender, it's useful and it can catch you out sometimes. So the settings on this one were 0.5 for all of the scale settings. So having set up both of our scaling and translation nodes, we have a lot of little repeats here. So we come out of there and we just need to color in, as it were, this area between them. So we'll add a color mix node, drop that in there, put it on the bottom and set the other side to black. Once that's composited, you can see that's filled it in nicely, and we've got lots of little duplicates. And if you look closely, you can see they're all pointing in different directions. And then what we can do is we can turn the brightness down a little bit here, because we don't want it being too bright, because this is supposed to be the background, perhaps 0.05. And now we need to overlay our original image. So I'm going to add a converter, which is a color ramp, drop that in about there, and take the image to one side of it. We'll just have a look at what's coming out of our color ramp. And then I'm going to set the top slider down very, very low. It can be very low indeed, and just set this to cardinal to give it a sharp fall off. And you can see we've now got essentially a mask for our shape. I'm going to add another color mix node, and I'm going to put that mask into the control on that color mix node. On the top goes our background. You can see that's appearing there now. And then on the bottom, we put our original image. I'm now going to add a glare node. So that's under filters. Drop that in there, set this to fog glow, leave it on medium. I used a mix of -0.3 and a threshold of 1.2 because it was a bit too glowy, and a size of 7, just brought the size down a little bit. At this point, if you want to, you can do some color balance, and I just sort of came down a little bit on gamma into the red yellow sort of area, and a similar direction for the gain, just to warm the image up a little bit. Then add another filter, which is also a glare filter, but set this one to ghosts. I set it to 4 iterations, color modulation of about 0.4, mix about -0.975, and the threshold of about 3.5. You can see we get some wild effects while it's doing that. And you can just about see we've got some ghosts appearing there. And that's it. So I'll go through and explain what that node setup did again. First of all, we blurred a version of our image slightly, just to smooth it out slightly. Then we created a new node group in which we had a scale node, basically halving or quartering, in fact, so half on the X, half on the Y, the scale of our image. Then moving it into the bottom left-hand corner. This one then moved it into top right-hand corner of the resulting image, and so on. So we created 4 versions of our image, 4 little images, and put each one in a different corner. We mixed them all together with these 3 nodes, and then that was output. Then we did almost the same thing again, or pretty much is the same thing again, only this time much smaller again. That's an 1/8 this time, 0.125, and again mix it in exactly the same way. We also halved the value of the X for each of them. You can play around with these numbers, but really this is just about how many objects you want spread across the grid. So the output of that first node group just feeds into the second one. You can copy the node group, but don't forget to click the little 2 that will appear, otherwise you'll have only one node group really. You then need to put that into a mix node like this. If I mute that mix node, you'll see what that one's doing. It's basically filling in the gaps between them, between those individual images. And then we take our original image and we put it into a color ramp, narrowed in quite a lot with its 2 sliders, so it creates a mask. That feeds into all the factor of a mix node. We put our newly created background into one side, the original image into the other. That mask that we created means that the background won't show through or won't be mixed with our foreground. The foreground will appear to sit on top of it. We added a fog glow glare. We put a bit of color balance on there just to basically redden the image slightly. We added a ghosts glare node, and then that's it. And you can see that's now looking pretty similar to the thing that I created. I also denoised mine. So if we come into here, we can switch on denoising, and I just used all the basic settings. I didn't change those at all, but you don't really need subsurface. If you've got any diffuse materials in there, you will need the diffuse shader, but you don't really need subsurface unless you're using a very different material than the one I'm using. So if we give that a render, and it's just because of the size of the light that we're getting that big pink section there, and you can just play around with those as you want. But essentially that's it. Just a little note about rendering. That was rendered at 25 samples. You don't want to go for too high a sample typically, because obviously you're rendering an animation. That particular frame took 37 seconds to render. So that's still quite long really for an animation if you're going to do it on your home PC, but it's not too bad with denoising, and you can play around with the settings and samples and so on. I haven't even turned on clamping, so if you put clamping on, clamp direct and indirect, make sure that you turn this little clock on, because obviously that's going to manage the noise in the scene and make sure it's not too noticeable. And we can now turn this down to say 50 samples, and in my case I'm going to set this to 512 there. And let's just give that one last render. And there we go, it's a much smoother scene. We possibly have clamped it a bit too much there for the sparkles that we're looking for. And what I would probably do is turn this down to perhaps 16. So a larger number there will be effectively clamp it slightly less. And obviously we can play around with things like the gamma, the exposure and so on. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well, and I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.